I now present to you today's webinar entitled Community First, Applying CBR to Develop Innovative Technologies, presented by Dr. Herman Taylor and Mr. Thomas Cotton. In compliance with ACCME guidelines, the following presenters have no financial nor other relationship with the manufacturers of any commercial service discussed in this educational activity.
Okay, I am no longer muted. Is that right? Okay, well, I was just going through a couple of opening remarks, thanking the Prevention Research Center for sponsoring this webinar. And I welcome you all to a discussion about something that we are, with the fantastic help of the PRC, launching called Moyo. Moyo is Swahili for heart. And I think the fact that we chose that language and chose heart will become, it'll become clear to you why we have emblazoned everything we can with the term Moyo and what we hope for in terms of achieving in heart health. The first slide just reminds us all of the burden of chronic disease that the United States experiences year after year, 45% of us having at least one chronic disease. And in terms of cost, you can see that trillions of dollars are spent on chasing these chronic diseases, many of which are preventable. So there's the human cost of illness and in some cases early death, and the actual bottom line cost that impacts us in a variety of ways that actually compounds the problems of paying for health care access and prevention. If you look at the question of disparities, which I'm certain that most, if not everyone on the line, is very, very aware of, African Americans continue to suffer from a range of disparities that really span all of the diseases that are monitored and followed by our agencies like the CDC. It's a woeful tale of excess death and excess morbidity that African Americans have borne almost since the founding of the Republic. More specifically, if we look at cardiovascular disease, the situation is particularly acute. The map that you see that's somewhat mobile shows year to year the prevalence and also the peculiar geographic distribution, which shows you that in general, speaking in general terms, the East is a more dangerous place than the West of the western part of the United States in terms of death from cardiovascular disease. And the South is particularly hard hit. And you can see that from our latest data from the CDC, that as late as 2013, this pattern is still solidly established across the country. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, Louisiana are unfortunately the poster children for difficulties and death related to cardiovascular disease. Although overall cardiovascular disease death has declined, the challenge is that it is still the #1 killer of Americans and still way too frequently the cause of death and disability. Speaking of the disparities, a brief history lesson, if you will. All of the problems related to differences between the races here within the geographic United States were focused on, in particular, in the Heckler Report in 1985. Now, this brought to a head the scholarship and the thinking around health disparities, and really focused the attention of the entire healthcare enterprise on an unacceptable set of circumstances. Some of the excerpts from the note from Dr. Heckler, the author of the person who commissioned the report that was put together by a large group of scholars from across the spectrum of American health, pointed out that Americans were actually living longer. Infant mortality had declined overall. However, there was a big but. There was a continuing disparity noted dramatically in 1985, but that pattern has continued. And the disparity has existed ever since accurate federal record keeping began many years ago. And Dr. Heckler concluded that it was an affront to both our ideals and to the ongoing genius of American medicine. And a part of the disparities can be traced to the non-involvement of African Americans and other minorities in healthcare research. There have been many barriers and many things to discourage that involvement. Famously, the Tuskegee study was a study that involved African American men in the Black Belt of Alabama, focused in Tuskegee, Alabama, where men with syphilis were allowed to go untreated despite the discovery of penicillin, and went on to not only infect their partners, but also infect, excuse me, transgenerationally, and impacting not only the primary victims of the disease, but also their children and their loved ones. Stories like this were very important and figure large, particularly in the baby boom generation, but also trickling down into younger people. That there's this problem with research and African Americans. And that was a very discouraging episode. And you compound that with the continued problems with the United States resolving and developing the firm political will to be sure that all people get health care adequate to their needs. This should not be in my view, should not be a controversial issue, but it remains controversial. And many states offered the opportunity to expand coverage, have found compelling reasons in their own mind not to do so. I think that's unfortunate, but it speaks to why there may not be trust in the medical enterprise, both research and clinical, among some African Americans. Now, there have been steps in the right direction, and I'm proud of my past association with the Jackson Heart Study, which we founded essentially in the year 2000 to respond to these health disparities. And it has gone a long way in terms of reaching out to African Americans. And it successfully recruited 5,300 people in a part of the country that was particularly, again, acutely aware of the challenges and abuses of things like the Tuskegee syphilis study, and who had tales of being deprived of health care by virtue of where they lived and who they were. The Jackson Heart Study, however, with the help primarily of this magic ingredient, that magic ingredient being the community, with their help, with the guidance of people who had, in fact, braved other research studies and embraced our mission and our goals, and helped carry the message of research and research opportunity and what that could mean for a legacy of health for people in not only in Jackson, Mississippi, but African Americans and even beyond African Americans. That was the magic ingredient, and employing various features of community involved participatory research, that really led to the success of the study, which continues today to be a major contributor to information on health in the African American population. In short, over the course of 3 years, we recruited over 5,300 African Americans, the majority of whom you may see were female, but that number was impressive, and it exceeds the initial recruitment success of studies like the famous Framingham study, upon which so much of what we do in American medicine is based. The Jackson Heart Study, I think, holds a lot of promise for continuing to rewrite the textbooks and the references on what it means to be healthy from a cardiovascular standpoint for blacks. Okay, so with that, also there are other studies that have joined and have offered important data. Studies like Cardia have, which is a longitudinal study that includes a significant number of African Americans that's been going on for the better part of 25 plus years. Other studies, other initiatives are all targeting health disparities. Health disparities is an issue that's on the tongue of just about every researcher who's interested in equity in health in America. Um, and certainly institutions like Morehouse School of Medicine are totally dedicated to advancing health equity. With all of this effort and attention, things might be imagined to be getting better. Um, but I would hasten to suggest that that's not the case. In fact, a fairly recent summary of an analysis done of the National Health Interview Survey um, suggested the following: that the disparity will increase for the next 1 or even 2 decades as younger generations grow older and replace previous generations. This set of circumstances really form the basis of why Moyo. Um, Moyo, we believe, has important new um, um, features that will enhance our ability to understand the real issues surrounding disparities in health by accessing more granular data on a more frequent basis. Understand the Jackson Heart Study, which is attempting to take a deep dive into the underpinnings of the disparity. The Jackson Heart Study sees people once every 3 years or 4 years or even longer, which is traditional for studies that are longitudinal in populations, studies like Framingham, Cardia, Mesa, and others. What Moyo, being an mHealth intervention or an mHealth approach, what it offers is the opportunity to assess important variables that impact health on a much more frequent basis, and as some of my engineering friends like to say, in the wild. And what they mean by in the wild is they're not sitting in a clinic, they're going about their usual activities, communications between the person involved and the people collecting the data or supplying information are personalized, they can be immediate, and with anonymity, people can contribute data to a large database that may give us new insights into what lays the groundwork for disparities, how they actually impact communities, and how they perpetuate, all with an idea of aiming towards preventing and or reducing disparities that impact minorities disproportionately. In particular, in its first iteration, we're interested in physical activity, sleep quality, and the other variables that you see listed. It is admittedly not everything because there are limits to the data acquisition that are present in terms of engineering and time and burden on the people who are participating. But we think that given so much that is already native to the phone that we can access, as well as some innovations that we include in the app, that we are opening the door to some interesting and potentially very important data. And I don't need to say that the flip side of accessing data is also having a channel for the dissemination of information and disseminating information about the individual themselves, as well as more information that's more generally applicable and helpful will be an important aspect of Moyo. So here's an example of some of the things that Moyo will give us data on. Um, Physical activity, environment, food, mood, social and social networking, and some measures that are important in terms of what we know about risk factors currently. All of these elements have been associated with health in one or more studies. Some of them have huge literatures backing up the importance of them for the determinants of health and disease in the population. But here with Moyo, with our emphasis on approaching marginalized populations, we feel that we are opening a door onto data that has been previously either beyond our reach in terms of the mechanics of having people come in to a clinic, interrupting their days and using the direct measurements to assess their health status versus people in the wild, giving data as they live their lives on an instantaneous basis. So, physical activity obviously is one of the important things when you talk about cardiovascular health, but it also pertains to a wide variety of health parameters. And the Moyo can not only give us and the participant information on their activity, not only that they are moving about or they're taking steps, but also it can, through the software, indicate the type of exercise or the form of transportation in this case that the individuals may be taking part in. And all of this information is electively available to the researcher, but it's always available to the participant. The participant can opt in or out of the submission of any of the types of data that I will describe. Environment, obviously a very important aspect of health, and we're increasingly attuned to that. Food deserts, as well as other concerns about environment are important in health. This particular map shows the sort of twin risk of having no car and no supermarket within a mile. And what's interesting about this map showing the concentration of individuals who can be described as having no car and no supermarket nearby, that reminds you very much of the mortality map. Again, going back and forth on it, you can see how comparable the mortality map for cardiovascular disease is to the one for the challenges that a lot of Americans face in terms of environmental aspects of environmental variables that impact health. So Moyo will allow that. It will also allow an assessment of the degree to which your location at any time is a food desert, prompting you to prompting you to pay attention to opportunities for healthy food and avoidance of let's say fast foods, which you can be very highly selective and pick things out in a fast food restaurant. It's possible to eat things that are somewhat healthy there, but your options multiply if you put yourself in an area where there's more variety. And through other mechanisms, we're able to give you information about the ambient pollution, either where you live or where you are, as well as current weather conditions. All of these data are important, and I think a lot of it needs to be determined just how important each of these types of data are. Approaches like mobile health, like Moyo, can give us real information about these issues and give us some data on patterns in marginalized communities, which heretofore might not have been as accessible as needed to give a full picture of American health and risk for cardiovascular disease and other types of disease. We'll be able to also monitor your food intake. Again, this is all voluntary, and it also calls on the participants in Moyo to be participants in the further development of Moyo. Something that Mr. Cotton will probably touch on is the importance thus far of Moyo's development depending upon the community. Moyo would not be here. Moyo would not be Moyo without ongoing input of members in the community, and we can talk more specifically about that later in the webinar. But here, the citizen scientist aspect of Moyo comes into play, where people will take pictures of their food and submit descriptions, very brief and hopefully unobtrusively, submit that information, and we will through the magic of excuse me, of large data sets and accumulating large numbers of submissions, that we will be able to um, automate and digitize this information to make it even more usable as well as informative to researchers. Similarly to the other variables, your mood can be very important to your health, and this is very easily accessible by Moyo. Again, the large data that we will receive will, I think, paint interesting and important pictures that may point to interventions that would be healthful and helpful. And blood pressure, this is somewhat like the food, but we will have the capability to prompt the individuals to have their blood pressure taken and then take pictures of the readouts that they get. And with enough data, we'll be able again to digitize this and make it much more user friendly and easy to analyze. And this is my last slide, and it's a really important one because I think privacy and protection of data is an important issue in any investigation like this, any service like this. Um, every individual makes the decision for themselves about what data they will upload into the Moyo database. All information will be available to them. Um, it will be up to them, a volitional choice for them to say, I want to donate this particular data to the Moyo database. It will be anonymized. You will not be able to be identified, but the accumulation of vast amounts of data will again open, I believe, new avenues for us to explore in terms of health for the African American population and other marginalized populations. And with that, with that, I'll turn things over